For decades, Microsoft Windows stood at the center of personal computing. From offices and classrooms to gaming setups and home computers, Windows became more than just an operating system. It became the default expectation. People didn't ask what operating system a computer used. They simply assumed it was Windows. That dominance shaped the entire PC industry for generations. Software developers built applications for Windows first. Hardware companies optimized their products for Windows compatibility. Schools trained students on Windows machines. Businesses standardized entire workflows around Microsoft ecosystems. Even internet cafes, repair shops, and gaming communities revolved around Windows. It was not just popular, it was practically unavoidable. But something interesting has started happening in recent years. A growing number of users are beginning to question whether Windows still deserves its position at the top of personal computing. The release of Windows 11 was supposed to represent the next evolution of Microsoft's operating system strategy. A modern platform designed for the future of work, gaming, productivity, and cloud integration. Instead, for many users, Windows 11 became a symbol of growing frustration with the direction Microsoft has chosen. At the same time, Linux, an operating system once considered too technical for normal users, has quietly evolved into something far more accessible, polished, and practical than many people realize. What was once a niche ecosystem used mostly by programmers, server administrators, and enthusiasts is now attracting gamers, students, creators, developers, and even everyday computer users looking for an alternative. This shift is raising an important question. Is Windows 11's decline inevitable? And is Linux truly rising as the next major force in personal computing? To understand why this conversation matters, it's important to understand how Windows reached this point in the first place. Microsoft built its empire during a time when personal computing itself was expanding rapidly. Windows benefited from massive software compatibility, aggressive partnerships with manufacturers, and the convenience of familiarity. By the early 2000s, Windows had become deeply embedded into everyday life. If you bought a computer, it probably came with Windows pre-installed. If you needed software, it was likely designed for Windows. If you wanted to play games, Windows was the obvious choice. Even when Microsoft made mistakes, users usually stayed. Windows Vista faced criticism for performance issues and hardware compatibility problems. Yet Windows survived because people still depended on it. Windows 8 confused users with its tablet-focused interface. But Microsoft corrected course with Windows 10, which became one of the most successful operating systems ever released. This pattern created the belief that Microsoft was simply too dominant to fail in the desktop market. However, Windows 11 introduced a very different kind of problem. Instead of merely annoying users with interface changes, it began making many people feel like they were losing control over their own computers. One of the biggest complaints surrounding Windows 11 has been its strict hardware requirements. Millions of perfectly functional PCs were suddenly labeled unsupported because they lacked TPM 2.0 chips or newer processors. For users with older but still powerful systems, this felt less like technological progress and more like forced obsolescence. People who had invested in high-end hardware only a few years earlier suddenly found themselves excluded from Microsoft's vision of the future. Some users upgraded unnecessarily. Others ignored Windows 11 completely. But many started asking a question they had never seriously considered before. If their perfectly good computer was no longer good enough for Microsoft, why continue depending on Microsoft at all? This question became even more important as Windows 11 continued adding features many users never requested. Advertisements inside the operating system, Microsoft account requirements, telemetry collection, cloud integration pressure, and increasingly aggressive attempts to push services like OneDrive and Microsoft Edge created a growing sense that Windows was no longer designed primarily for the user. Instead, it often felt designed to maximize engagement with Microsoft's broader ecosystem. Even simple tasks started becoming more complicated. Changing default browsers became less intuitive. Local account creation became harder during installation. Settings, menus continued to feel fragmented between legacy control panels and modern interfaces. Users who valued simplicity, privacy, and control began feeling alien. At the same time, Linux was undergoing its own transformation. Traditionally, Linux suffered from a reputation problem. People viewed it as an operating system for experts, filled with command-line interfaces, confusing package managers, and complicated installation processes. While some of that reputation was based on truth in earlier decades, modern Linux distributions have changed dramatically. Today, operating systems like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora, Pop!_OS, Zorin OS, and many others provide polished graphical experiences that can rival or even surpass Windows in certain areas. Installation has become easier. Hardware support has improved significantly. Software stores now provide user-friendly ways to install applications. Desktop environments such as GNOME and KDE Plasma offer sleek, modern interfaces that feel intuitive even to new users. For many people trying Linux for the first time today, the experience is completely different from what they expected. Instead of struggling with cryptic commands for basic tasks, they find systems that boot quickly, stay responsive, and avoid much of the clutter that frustrates them on Windows. One of Linux's greatest strengths is efficiency. Windows 11 continues growing heavier with each update, requiring more RAM, more storage, and more background processing. Linux distributions, on the other hand, often run smoothly, even on older hardware. This has become increasingly important during a time when economic uncertainty makes people less willing to replace computers every few years. A laptop that struggles with Windows 11 may feel fast and usable again after installing Linux. This alone has introduced countless users to the Linux ecosystem. Students, budget-conscious consumers, and environmentally conscious users are discovering that they can extend the life of older hardware instead of throwing it away. The environmental angle here is often overlooked but extremely important. Electronic waste is a growing global issue. Millions of computers are discarded not because the hardware has failed, but because modern software no longer supports them efficiently. Linux offers an alternative model. Instead of forcing hardware replacement cycles, it allows devices to remain functional for years longer. This creates a powerful contrast with Microsoft's current direction. Windows 11's requirements push people toward newer hardware, while Linux embraces hardware freedom. In an age where sustainability matters more than ever, this difference could become increasingly significant. Gaming, historically Windows' strongest advantage, is also changing in ways that benefit Linux. For years, gaming was considered the ultimate reason not to switch. Most major games targeted Windows exclusively. Anti-cheat systems often blocked Linux users. Graphics drivers were inconsistent. Compatibility layers were unreliable. But the situation today is radically different. Valve's investment in Proton, a compatibility layer allowing Windows games to run on Linux through Steam, has transformed Linux gaming. Thousands of games now run surprisingly well on Linux, often with minimal effort from users. The success of the Steam Deck further accelerated this shift by proving that Linux-based gaming systems could appeal to mainstream audiences. The Steam Deck is especially important because it changed perceptions. Instead of Linux being seen as an experimental operating system for hobbyists, millions of gamers suddenly interacted with a Linux-powered device without even realizing it. They cared about whether the games worked, not what kernel powered the system. As developers increasingly optimize games for Steam Deck compatibility, Linux compatibility improves overall. This creates momentum that didn't exist a decade ago. While Windows still dominates gaming overall, the gap is narrowing enough that many users no longer see gaming as a complete barrier to switching. Another major factor driving Linux adoption is the changing nature of software itself. In the past, users depended heavily on Windows-specific desktop applications. Today, many workflows have moved to the browser or cross-platform tools. Web applications dominate communication, productivity, media consumption, and even creative work. Applications like Discord, Spotify, Slack, Zoom, VS Code, Firefox, Chrome, and many others work seamlessly on Linux. Cloud-based services further reduce operating system dependency. Many people now spend most of their computer time inside browsers rather than native desktop applications. This weakens Windows' historical advantage. If your essential tools work everywhere, operating system choice becomes more flexible. Suddenly, users can prioritize privacy, performance, customization, or freedom rather than pure compatibility. Privacy has become another major issue, influencing public perception. Windows 11's telemetry and cloud integration strategies have raised concerns among users who feel increasingly uncomfortable with data collection practices. While Microsoft argues that telemetry improves user experience and security, critics believe users should have greater transparency and control. Linux benefits from a fundamentally different philosophy. Most Linux distributions are open source, meaning their code can be inspected by anyone. This transparency creates trust among users who value privacy and accountability. While Linux is not magically immune to security or privacy issues, its ecosystem generally empowers users rather than locking them into centralized corporate systems. Customization is another area where Linux shines. Windows 11 offers some personalization options, but Microsoft maintains tight control over the overall user experience. Linux, by contrast, allows users to shape nearly every aspect of the system. Desktop environments, workflows, themes, animations, window behavior, and even core system components can be adjusted. For enthusiasts, this flexibility is incredibly appealing. But increasingly, even normal users appreciate having choices. Some people want a macOS-like interface. Others prefer traditional desktop layouts, similar to Windows. 7. Linux makes these possibilities accessible without requiring users to accept Microsoft's design decisions. The developer community also plays a huge role in Linux's rise. Software development increasingly relies on Linux environments, especially in cloud computing, containers, DevOps, and server infrastructure. Many developers already use Linux professionally, making desktop adoption a natural extension. This trend has cultural implications. Developers influence technology conversations, create software tools, and shape online communities. As more developers embrace Linux desktops, the ecosystem gains momentum through tutorials, community support, and application development. Meanwhile, Microsoft's relationship with power users has become more complicated. Historically, Windows attracted enthusiasts because it balanced accessibility with flexibility. But as Windows 11 grows more restrictive and disoriented, some advanced users feel the platform is moving away from them. Ironically, Microsoft itself has acknowledged Linux's importance more than ever before. The company once treated Linux as a threat. Former Microsoft executives famously described open-source software in hostile terms. But modern Microsoft now integrates Linux deeply into its own ecosystem through Windows Subsystem for Linux, Azure Cloud Services, and open-source projects. This shift demonstrates an important reality. Linux is no longer a fringe curiosity. It is central to modern computing infrastructure. Even Microsoft depends on Linux technologies in critical areas. However, despite Linux's growth, it is important to remain realistic about the challenges it still faces. Windows remains dominant for several reasons that cannot be ignored. Enterprise environments rely heavily on Microsoft ecosystems. Specialized professional software, like Adobe Creative Cloud, Autodesk AAD, and certain enterprise applications still work best on Windows. Hardware vendors continue prioritizing Windows support. Many users simply prefer familiarity and do not want to learn a new system. Linux fragmentation can also confuse newcomers. Unlike Windows, which offers a relatively unified experience, Linux includes countless distributions, desktop environments, package managers, and workflows. While this flexibility is empowering for experienced users, it can overwhelm beginners. Technical issues still exist too. Some printers, Wi-Fi adapters, audio devices, and proprietary software can create compatibility frustrations on Linux. Although the situation is far better than it once was, the ecosystem still requires patience in certain scenarios. Yet, what matters is not whether Linux will completely replace Windows overnight. That is unlikely in the near future. The more important question is whether Windows is losing the unquestioned dominance it once enjoyed. On that front, the answer increasingly appears to be yes. For the first time in decades, average users are seriously considering alternatives. That psychological shift alone is enormous. People who never imagined leaving Windows are now experimenting with Linux distributions, watching tutorials, installing dual boot systems, and discovering communities eager to help them transition. YouTube channels dedicated to Linux have exploded in popularity. Forums discussing open-source software attract millions of readers. Tech influencers increasingly showcased Linux desktops not as novelty projects but as practical, daily systems. The rise of ARM-based computing may accelerate these changes even further. Apple's transition to Apple Silicon demonstrated that traditional x86 dominance is no longer guaranteed. As ARM devices become more common, operating system ecosystems may become more fluid and less dependent on historical compatibility expectations. Linux is particularly well positioned for this future because of its adaptability. Linux already powers everything from servers and supercomputers to Android smartphones, smart TVs, routers, and embedded devices. Its flexibility allows it to evolve across hardware architectures far more easily than operating systems, tied closely to legacy ecosystems. Meanwhile, Microsoft faces growing competition, not only from Linux, but from changing computing habits overall. Younger generations increasingly rely on smartphones, tablets, and cloud services rather than traditional desktop PCs. The desktop operating system itself is becoming less central to many people's digital lives. In this environment, forcing users into tightly controlled ecosystems becomes riskier. If people feel frustrated enough, they may simply leave the platform entirely rather than tolerate increasing restrictions. Subscription models also contribute to dissatisfaction. Modern software increasingly pushes recurring payments, cloud dependencies, and service integrations. Many users feel exhausted by constant monetization strategies. Linux, by contrast, still represents a world where users can own and control their computing experience without endless ups. This philosophical difference matters deeply. Technology is no longer just about performance specifications. It is increasingly about trust, freedom, ownership, and control. Users are asking fundamental questions about who their computers really serve. Does the operating system exist to help the user, or does the user exist to feed data and engagement into corporate ecosystems? Linux communities often frame their movement around digital freedom, and that message resonates more strongly as people grow skeptical of large technology companies. Education could become another important battleground. Schools and universities constantly face budget pressures. Linux offers cost-effective solutions for aging hardware and computer labs. Students introduced to Linux environments early may become more comfortable adopting them professionally later. Governments around the world have also shown periodic interest in reducing dependency on proprietary American software ecosystems. Open-source solutions provide strategic advantages related to transparency, sovereignty, and long-term cost management. While adoption varies widely, these efforts contribute to Linux's growing legitimacy. Artificial intelligence and machine learning may also shape the future in unexpected ways. Much of the AI infrastructure powering modern systems already runs on Linux servers. Developers working in AI often prefer Linux environments because of compatibility with machine learning frameworks and development tools. As AI becomes increasingly integrated into consumer computing, Linux's strong presence in back-end infrastructure could strengthen its overall ecosystem further. There is also a cultural aspect to Linux's rise that cannot be ignored. Linux communities often emphasize collaboration, experimentation, and user empowerment. For many people, switching to Linux feels less like adopting software and more like joining a movement. That sense of community contrasts sharply with the increasingly corporate and monetized feel of mainstream technology ecosystems. Forums, wikis, open-source contributors, and passionate volunteers create an environment where users often feel supported rather than exploited. Of course, Linux communities are not perfect. Toxic elitism and gatekeeping have historically discouraged newcomers in some spaces. But many modern Linux communities actively work to become more welcoming and beginner-friendly because they recognize that accessibility is essential for growth. Another reason Windows 11 faces criticism is the perception that innovation has slowed. Many users feel modern operating systems no longer deliver transformative improvements comparable to earlier eras of computing. Instead, updates often focus on cosmetic redesigns, advertising, integration, or ecosystem lock-in. Linux distributions, despite being free and community-driven, frequently feel more responsive to user feedback. Bugs are often addressed transparently. Users can choose lightweight systems focused on performance rather than marketing features. This responsiveness builds goodwill. The rise of creator culture and independent media has also helped Linux. Content creators now share tutorials, gaming benchmarks, desktop showcases, troubleshooting guides, and migration advice across platforms like YouTube and Reddit. This visibility reduces fear and uncertainty surrounding Linux adoption. Years ago, trying Linux often felt isolating. Today, users can find thousands of guides explaining every aspect of the experience. Communities provide immediate help. Documentation has improved dramatically. The barrier to entry continues shrinking. Cybersecurity concerns further influence perceptions. Windows remains the most targeted desktop operating system for malware because of its market share. While Linux is not immune to security risks, its architecture and permission systems often provide stronger security foundations. For businesses and technical users, security considerations matter greatly. Open-source auditing and rapid patching contribute to Linux's reputation for reliability in critical infrastructure environments. Remote work trends, accelerated by global events, also changed computing priorities. Many people realized they mainly needed browsers, communication tools, and stable performance, rather than deep dependency on Windows-exclusive software. Linux suddenly became viable for workflows that previously seemed impossible outside Microsoft ecosystems. Containerization and virtualization technologies also reduce operating system dependence. Developers can run isolated environments across platforms, further weakening arguments that users must remain on Windows for compatibility reasons. At the same time, Microsoft's increasing integration of AI features into Windows raises both excitement and concern. Some users appreciate AI assistance, while others worry about privacy implications, resource usage, and unwanted complexity. If these features feel intrusive rather than genuinely useful, they could push more users toward alternative systems, emphasizing simplicity and user control. The next decade of personal computing may ultimately revolve around a simple conflict between convenience ecosystems and user autonomy. Microsoft, Apple, Google, and other major companies increasingly build tightly integrated ecosystems designed to maximize retention and service usage. Linux represents a fundamentally different philosophy built around openness and modularity. For the first time in a very long time, Windows users are seriously imagining life beyond Windows. And once people realize they have alternatives, the entire industry changes forever.